In this video, I just want to fill you in on the details of the reflection and refraction model here in the Shading Models tab of the Surface Editor. These settings and options are pretty fundamental to the way that our materials will behave, and it is important to understand exactly what's going on with them. First of all, let me just point out these are not the only things that appear on the Shading Models tab. What we have, of course, are the different shading models that are available to us. The default, of course, is Photoreal, but this is where we also switch to the Shadow Catch or Cell Shade options. Notice, of course, if I just jump over to Cell Shade for this particular surface here, we'll see that we've still got a reflection options here as well. So what I'm about to go through, even though we're going to look at it in the Photoreal shading model, does actually apply elsewhere with other shading models as well. So what have we got here? Well, we've got just a few spheres on a ground plane, and as you can see, we've got, reflections on here. We're just using the good old principled material, again, something that we'll see later. And we also have, of course, a backdrop high dynamic range image here, which is the old Brooklyn Bridge that we've seen before. Of course, we've just got that on textured environment. So let's take a look at these reflection and refraction options. First of all, you'll notice this checkmark, Glossy Reflections. You'll see that if I turn that off again, I'm just looking at the large main ball here. You can see that the reflection there goes away. Now clearly you can see there's a couple of things that are ordinarily being reflected. There is, of course, the backdrop image of the old Brooklyn Bridge, but we've also got the ray traced reflections here of the other spheres in the scene. Yes, but we do still have a highlight with our glossy reflections turned off. That highlight is actually from this. It's a distant light that is just a single distant light sitting here in our scene. Basically, what glossy reflections is whether reflection tracing is turned on or off. This is kind of sort of a bit of a legacy toggle for stuff when it's brought in from previous versions of Lightwave prior to 2018. Remember, of course, when we discussed specularity and we said that now in 2018 all of our speculars are properly ray traced, whereas before when we had a specular value on something it was this cheat. And of course, if you remember earlier versions of Lightwave, you didn't get true reflections with specular, you just got these specular hits from light. Essentially, that's what the glossy reflections does. The light here, this little hit that we're getting, that is still actually ray traced. If I change my light here over to an area light, let's say, then look, you can see that the reflection that we're getting in the ball here, the highlight, is this square. We're getting the actual area light itself. You see I can scale it up there, and of course the highlight has scaled up. So we're getting a ray traced reflection of the light object, but that is all. Of course, prior to 2018, this would just create a sort of a smudge, a soft or a glossy type highlight. You wouldn't get the shape of the light in the reflection like that. So glossy reflections off does give us a ray traced reflection, but it only works for actual lights, actual light. Now let me demonstrate something else that will happen because of that. If we change our light here over to an environment light, yes, we haven't covered environment lights yet, but of course we will later on. You might want to jump back and have a look at this then. Notice what we're now getting. We're getting a reflection of the environment. If you've seen the backgrounds video, hopefully you have, then you'll be aware that the environment can sample backdrop, and so it casts light of the backdrop itself. You see, if I turn that off, I'm just now getting, this plain white, because of course now it's just a white light. But of course what we're getting is a ray traced reflection of the light itself, and the light sort of, you can think of it as being surfaced or textured with the backdrop in this instance. Same would be true if I had a area light again and I turned on portal. So you should now start to see there's some detail from the background coming through there. It's a little small. Let's zoom in. There you can see there's the corner of the Brooklyn Bridge showing up there in the reflection coming through from the portal light. Again, portal lights, we'll look at them in detail later. So when we have glossy reflections turned on, what we get is not just the traced highlight from the actual light objects in our scene, we also get fully ray traced reflections, as of course our specular. You see that if I just switch this back to the old standard material here, which of course has specular there, let's put the specular up to 100%, then you see that we're getting this old style specular. Note of course I've got glossy reflections off. If I turn glossy reflections on, then I get true ray traced reflections. Of course, using the old standard material I can get this sort of specular, but if I'm wanting reflections I still have a reflection option here, and so of course that allows me to get it going both ways. So there is that. Now let me just switch back to the old principled again for a moment. We'll come over here and turn our glossy reflections back on. Now notice our reflection options. We have ray trace and backdrop. Now I could set to ray trace only. In this case, you see we get the opposite of what happened when I switched to the environment with glossy off previously. Now I'm getting the ray traced reflection of the other spheres in the scene, plus of course still that area light, but now the backdrop is no longer being ray traced. Of course, if I take my actual light here and we pop it right back over to being an environment light again, then we're getting a reflection of the backdrop, which isn't really coming from the backdrop, it's coming from the environment light. So we're getting a light object reflection and ray traced surface reflections, other objects in the scene. So what happens in a situation like this when I take an environment light, as I've got here, and I've got a background, going on in the scene and all of that, and I have the option of ray trace plus backdrop? Well, hey, look at what's happened to the reflection there in this main ball. Look at how it's blown out. Let's just come in nice and close and we can look at this again in a little more visual detail here for you. Here it is. This is ray trace only, and we can see the level of the reflection there. And here is ray trace plus backdrop, and it's gone blown out. The reason for this is because we're getting double reflection now. We're getting it reflected once from the environment light and reflected again from the backdrop. What this means is that we're getting too much reflection and we're sort of going outside of PBR, because rather than our reflective object reflecting whatever percentage of light is falling on it, it's reflecting twice that amount. If you recall back in the diffuse video, we mentioned about the equivalencies of, turning the brightness of the colour up or the brightness of the light down, and how all of these things were largely equivalent and how you could get doubling up. And of course, when we looked at energy conservation, we saw how we could get doubling up if we had, specular turned up and diffuse turned up. Essentially, that's what we're getting here. We've got reflection on twice, and it's not because of anything we've done in the main material here, it's because of the way that we've treated our reflections. So let's get rid of the glossy reflections for a minute there. In fact, let's just turn the specular down to 0 temporarily. There we are. Now we've just got a diffuse ball. And let us instead turn up our transparency some, shall we? So there we go, 60% transparency. We've got this sort of glassy ball. And what we'll look at now are the refraction options. Now these work in broadly the same way. Let's just switch back to an old distant light there, so we're not having that interference from the environment light. And let's have a look at this. If we set our refraction to ray trace only, then once again you can see that we're getting this refracted view of the other objects in the scene, the other spheres that are behind that there, but we're not getting the refraction of the backdrop. If we do ray trace plus backdrop, then we're getting this refracted view of our backdrop image. Once again, if we have an environment light, well, look what happens. We're getting this double lit kind of refraction as well, where our backdrop appears as if doubly bright. Why? Because just like we saw with reflection, we've got ray trace plus backdrop. If we switch this to ray trace only, then we only get that coming from the environment light. But notice this little toggle on my environment light, visible to camera. If I turn that off, then my refraction of the environment light goes away, and if I set it to ray trace plus backdrop, now I'm getting just the backdrop because there is no visibility in refractions of the environment light. Okay, so we may be wondering, what does this all mean for actual usage? Because we've got these different ways of doing it with this thing on and that thing off, and this is this light and that's that light type, blah, blah, blah. How do we mix all of these together? Well, here's the first thing about using this Glossy Reflections thing. If you are bringing in previous content from earlier versions of Lightwave, that will generally be using the standard material. Often in that case, you want Glossy Reflections off. That, of course, will give you the outcome whereby, if we just go back to the good old distant light here, we get these simple specular effects just from the light only, and if we want reflection, then we would have an actual reflection value. Of course, if we had a backdrop, then we would be having that set to ray trace plus backdrop, unless, of course, we'd chosen to employ an environment light, in which case we would go ray trace only, and of course our specular would be giving us reflection of that environment light. Now, of course, the shading system between earlier versions of Lightwave and 2018 doesn't match, so you'll get a look that approximates what you had in the earlier versions. And it's basically a way, having this glossy reflections turned off, that's a way for content brought from earlier versions to give an approximate match to what you had before, still get a half decent render without having to go through the rigmarole of, redoing your materials for the new PBR system. However, when we are creating stuff fresh in 2018, or when we're changing previous content to work fully and completely with the 2018 system, here's the way I recommend going. Let's switch to distant light just for a moment so as we can be nice and clear. We will use one of the nice 2018 materials, like the Principled, for instance. Have glossy reflections turned on, reflection set to ray trace only, and refraction set to ray trace only. Okay, but what if you want the refraction from your backdrop? Generally, what you will want to have is in your scene, if you are using a backdrop image for reflection or for lighting, is to have an environment light in your scene and make sure visible to camera is turned on. Now, we'll see more details about actually working with environment lighting and interior lighting in later videos, and we will come back and point out these settings again when we get there. But in general, most of the time, almost every single time, the best combination of choices to work nice and cleanly with the PBR system is glossy reflections on, ray traced only reflections, ray traced only refractions, and visible to camera on for your lights. This visible to camera thing going, of course, for other light types, not just the environment light. Notice now that we're in area mode, this little bright square that's coming through here, that is the refraction of my area light. You see that if I turn that off, then that guy goes away. So there we have it. That is the reflection and refraction shading model, how we want to set it up for our surfaces, depending, of course, whether we're trying to match stuff from previous Lightwave versions or set things up to work the best way in 2018 with a PBR workflow. As I said, there are some elements there that we'll come back to in later videos when we look at environmental and interior lighting, which will help this to make more sense. But for now, those are the basics, and if you're just wanting a quick rule of thumb to follow, it's for all your surfaces, have glossy reflections on, ray trace only for reflections and refractions, and visible to camera turned on in your light properties.